Chapter 27. Broken Wings. Reyes was on his feet again. He had been so badly battered that even though he knew the power of magic, he still found it hard to believe that he was almost as good as new. Reyes was standing by what had once been the gateway to the old castle courtyard, its location marked in the ground by a huge semicircular line cut through the earth, marking the wall foundations. He was joined by his wife, Gagara, and both of his daytime bodyguards. Here they stood, watching the movements of the elves in the nearby trees, while they waited for the last of the soldiers to enter the painting. The elves were gathering in large numbers at the tree line, regiment after regiment, all preparing to charge in and slaughter anyone they met. There were a couple of thousand men-at-arms, archers and cavalry, all in neat little rows, waiting for the order to attack. "Why don't they attack?" Gagara asked. She glanced behind her. "Mangloss is putting the last regiment into the painting now. They must see they have us totally outnumbered." "I don't know," was all Reyes could say. He couldn't resist glancing briefly round at what was happening behind him. He was just in time to see the last regiment of the king's men disappearing into the painting. That only left the king and queen, Mangloss, and themselves. "There are only 7 of us left on the field. Perhaps they're wondering where the rest of us had gone." "Seems doubtful," Gagara replied. The king and queen walked calmly over to Mangloss. They grasped each other's hands, and then Jenny placed her free hand against the surface of the painting. A moment later, Mangloss was alone with the harpies. "Come," Reyes told the others, "we should go and meet him. I'll need to claim that painting." "Tenegi and I will wait here," my chief, Quinnigoff suggested, "just in case the elves try something." "Very well," Reyes agreed. "Be ready to leave in the instant I've secured the painting." He turned and with Gagara walked over to meet Mangloss. Mangloss greeted Reyes amicably, then he got straight down to business. "Once we get to Arliss, you might want to fetch me first, so I can erect some kind of illusory field to hide the deployment of our soldiers from any watching eyes." "I'll find you first," Reyes agreed. "Good," Mangloss commented. "Our war effort might depend on doing things in the right order. Are you sure you're capable of flying? Your wings were badly damaged. You really should take a day off to rest them properly." "I'll be fine," Reyes insisted. "Well, go easy on them anyway," Mangloss suggested. "I know you can probably make the flight in 2 days, but it's already lunchtime, so I won't expect you to arrive until the 3rd. "Fair enough," Reyes agreed. "Ideally, we want to deploy our forces in the morning, so we'll have all day for the battle. By all means, get to Arliss the night before, but it might be worth you spending the night somewhere in First Town, and making the final short hop to Arliss on the following day." 4 days then," Reyes agreed. 4 days, the mage confirmed. "That'll be plenty of time," Reyes claimed. "We'll be there." "Good," Mangloss acknowledged. "I don't need to tell you that the future of mankind lays in your hand. If we fail, our entire race will be enslaved by the elves." "We'll make it," Reyes assured the mage. "Good," Mangloss repeated. "Very well, if that's everything, I'll join the others in the painting. Now, be quick. Once I'm in the painting, the illusion I've cast about this place will drop suddenly, and the elves will be able to see that there are really only 4 of you. Once that happens, they're likely to rush in to get you. Get airborne as quickly as you can." "Illusion?" Reyes commented. "Yes," Mangloss replied with a broad grin on his face. "At the moment, the elves can see a huge army of bloodthirsty warriors waiting for them. They can see line after line, thousands upon thousands of soldiers, men-at-arms, archers, cavalry and knights. Lots and lots of knights. I also added a few flocks of harpies for effect since the elves have had personal experience with your girls in combat." Gagara laughed. Reyes nodded. Now it made a lot more sense to him as to why the elves hadn't charged in and wiped them all out. "I guess you'd better get going." Mangloss, who up until now had been using magic to carry the painting, placed it gently on the ground face up. Then he crouched down next to it and placed his hand on the flat surface. A moment later, the mage had vanished into the painting. Almost immediately there came a shout from the trees at the edge of the forest. The elves were now realising that they had been tricked, and it wasn't going to take them long to come to their senses and attack. "My chief," Quinnigoff shouted. "They're advancing." Reyes glanced briefly at where Quinnigoff and Tenegi were keeping watch, and then he turned his attention back to the painting. As Mangloss had done, he squatted down next to it and also placed his hand on the flat surface in the same way Mangloss had. Instead of entering the painting, though, he took the painting and placed it into his hammerstone ring. "Let's get out of here, boss," Tenegi suggested. She must have been watching Reyes rather than the advancing elves. The elves were flooding out from the trees now. Any preparations they had made to march neatly into the clearing to do battle with the human occupants had gone out of the window. Now, all that mattered to them was reaching the 4 harpies as quickly as they could before they took to the air. They didn't have much chance. It was far too far to run before the harpies got into the sky. The elves did have archers, though, and if they were quick enough, They might get into range before the harpies fled. Reyes couldn't help but feel a little overwhelmed for a moment. He tried not to dwell on it too much, but he couldn't help but think about how he now had over 100,000 people effectively sitting on his finger. It was a strange sensation, more psychological than physical. For a moment he felt as if he was on a par with one of the gods. "Boss," Tanegi insisted. "Yes," Reyes replied. "Go, I'll follow." Quinagoff took point. She launched herself into the air and flew straight up, or as straight up as she could manage. Reyes and Gagara followed close on her tail, with Tanegi bringing up the rear and trying to keep herself between Reyes and the elves. Had Reyes led the way, he would have taken them as far up as he could, flying until it became very hard to breathe, flying up until icicles began to appear on his wings. All he knew was that they had to get above the range of the elven arrows, but he had no idea how high that actually was, and would therefore fly as high as he could to avoid taking chances. Quinagoff, on the other hand, seemed to know exactly how high was high enough. It was cold enough without having to suffer needlessly with the even colder air that could be found at higher altitudes. Once she was happy with her height, she began to steer the way south, flying over the heads of the elves encamped on that side of the encampment. Reyes couldn't help but feel amused as they flew over rank after rank of elven soldiers, all of them gazing into the sky as their quarry made its escape. "Shame," Quinagoff voiced, "but I went before we left." "I didn't," Tanegi responded meaningfully. Gagara laughed. The elves had to take it. They had no way to hit back. They couldn't even use magic to enhance the range of their weapons, not with all the elven mages lying dead on the outskirts of the encampment. Even though they were flying away from the encampment, their height gave Reyes a good overview of that morning's battle. Along with the Inquisitors and their bodyguards, there were bodies from a few other elven regiments. Also among the dead were a fair number of humans and several harpies scattered here and there. "A lot more happened in that battle after I lost consciousness than I first thought," Reyes commented to Gagara. "It was fun," Gagara replied happily. "It turned into quite the battle," Tanegi said from somewhere just behind him. "We were greatly outnumbered, but fortunately that human woman saw we needed help and brought in a couple of regiments of soldiers to aid us. If she hadn't, I doubt any of us would be alive." "Human woman?" Reyes asked. "Your sister," Gagara commented. "The humans turned the tide of battle in our favour," Tanegi added. "We lost close to 200 of them, though." "I missed most of it," Reyes muttered. "What happened to the Dragon Man Mage?" "Same thing as happened to the rest of her regiment," Tanegi replied. Reyes nodded and pursued the thought no further. The Dragon Man could have been helpless and bleeding as he lay on the ground, and the harpies would still have killed him if they had found him alive, especially after what he had done to their mail. Quinagoff continued to lead them south, and soon the army that was besieging the encampment was left way behind. Reyes couldn't help but glance over his shoulder occasionally. He was looking for any sign of pursuit, but it looked as if Mangloss was right. The elven army had brought no harpies with them. No self-respecting harpy was going to want to be part of a besieging army for 4 months. Not in this weather. No, all the nearest villages were most likely curled up together around a huge bonfire, trying to expend as little energy as possible, except for the important things in life. Once they were well beyond the rear ranks of the elven army, Quinagoff brought them slowly lower, until they were skimming just lightly above the tops of the trees. It was warmer down here than it had been at that greater height, but it was still very cold. They flew south for only about half an hour, and were still well inside the borders of the Moth, when Reyes decided he could go no further for the moment, and needed to take a short rest in the branches of one of the trees that lined the King's Highway. Gagara came in to land next to him. "Are you all right, Hanson?" "Tired," Reyes commented simply. His wings were aching with the effort of having flown what was a relatively short distance. "Mangloss warned me to take things easy after this morning. I wish I had the time to rest. Just give me a minute." "No hurry," Gagara replied. She looked round suddenly as Tanegi took a perch in the branch of a neighbouring tree. "Look, it's easily gone lunchtime. Why don't I start a fire while we send your 2 bodyguards off to catch us something to eat?" Quinagoff had flown a fair distance further along the road before she realised she was no longer being followed, and doubled back. She landed at the base of the tree and immediately began to check her surroundings. "I was hoping to make it the sun's blessing by nightfall as we did last time we undertook such a journey," Reyes told his wife. "That's not going to happen if I keep having to stop for a rest." "It's not going to happen anyway," Gagara confided with him. "We're too far away. When we reached sun's blessing last time, it was because we started early in the morning. It's already gone lunchtime. Let's send your 2 bodyguards to find us something to eat." "You're hungry?" Reyes commented. Gagara nodded. "I haven't eaten since breakfast." "One of us should stay with you, my chief," Quinagoff advised. "Gagara and I will be fine," Reyes replied. "But my chief," Quinagoff protested, Gagara has been looking after me since long before I even met you, Reyes explained. Now go, and fetch us something to eat. Yes, my chief, Quinagoff agreed unhappily. She took to the air, flying low over the tops of the trees and looking for any sign of animal life. Right, boss, Tanegi offered. A moment later she too was in the air, flying after Quinagoff. Reyes watched them go for a minute, and then he looked back at Gagara. She was smiling. There was always something so cute about the way she smiled. Well, handsome, Gagara said, her hand stroking his body gently. We have some time alone. What do you want to do? We should try to get a fire lit, Reyes replied. Gagara looked deeply into her husband's eyes, and Reyes had the distinct impression that she was going to try and seduce him, right there in the treetops. Think we'll find any dry wood in all this? We can try, Reyes said. He loved Gagara, but he wasn't in the mood. He was too cold, too tired, and now he thought about it, he was feeling quite hungry. Just one thing, handsome, Gagara suggested. If we're going to be flying south through elven lands and over the villages of other harpies, maybe you should do something about your appearance. My appearance? Reyes nodded as the meaning of what Gagara had said sank in. It had been so long since he had travelled anywhere that he had forgotten to disguise himself as female. He did that now. The magic seemed to run along his body like a ripple, as everything about him changed subtly. Even his wings gained a more feminine edge to them. Happy? Gagara shook her head. Not happy, no. I prefer you as male. If we're going to survive to reach Arliss, though, this is better. When Quinagoff and Tanegi returned, Reyes and Gagara had managed to get a kind of fire going. It wasn't all that impressive, but it was enough to cook the 2 half-starved squirrels and the rabbit that the huntresses had brought back with them. There's not a lot out there, Tanegi explained as she laid her offerings on the ground by the fire. We're lucky to have these. It's too cold, my chief, Quinagoff voiced. There's simply nothing out there to catch. Winter had hit the land far too early this year. Creatures who had usually spent most of the summer and autumn months stocking up on food for the winter suddenly found themselves in the middle of a snowstorm with no time to prepare. Many of the animals in the northern half of Florida had either frozen or starved to death. Then there was a knock-on effect. Creatures who had considered those small animals as their prey couldn't find enough of them to feast on, and so they in turn suffered from much the same fate. This will keep us going for now, Reyes assured them. We can divide these 3 creatures 4 ways. Chief, Quinagoff suggested, if things start to get really bad, we can always get something to eat from the painting. Yes, Reyes agreed, though he wasn't too keen on the idea. He didn't want to risk putting the painting out of the hammerstone and exposing it to the elements, just because he was feeling a little bit hungry. It was an option, but something to be utilised only in the direst of need. For now, we should eat what we have, and maybe try to find a small village. A village, my chief, Quinagoff asked. A village, with an inn. An inn where they serve food, Reyes explained. Oh, Quinagoff commented. I thought you meant a village with huntresses and the like. After lunch they continued south. Again Quinagoff led the way with Tanegi bringing up the rear, flying in a kind of diamond or kite formation. Reyes lost track of time. All he knew for sure was that his wings had started to ache again shortly after they took back to the air, but he pushed on through the tiredness. He didn't want to stop without a very good reason. He started trying to glide a lot more, so that he only had to flap his wings occasionally, and he tried to stay in the slipstream caused by Quinagoff in order to lessen the amount of energy he needed to expend in order to stay aloft. Lunch had been such a pitiful meal that less than 2 hours later, Gagara commented, I'm feeling hungry again. Maybe we should start to look for that village. As you command, my leader, Quinagoff replied, not bothering to look round. Reyes was glad that his wife had said something. For all his willpower in staying aloft, he really did feel like he needed the rest. Not for the first time, he thought about how easy it would be to alleviate the tiredness of his wings with a little bit of magic. He had to constantly remind himself that the spell in question, while making his wings feel fresh and vital now, would have a rebound effect on him later that would probably cause him to miss the big battle. They were in Arliss now. Reyes couldn't really claim that he'd noticed the point at which they'd crossed the border with Demoth's neighbour. The only clue had been that the villages on the Demoth side of the building had been evacuated, and in some cases burnt to the ground to stop the elves gaining access to them. Most of those on the Arliss side of the border were still occupied. Quinagoff led the way, landing on one of the higher buildings of the village. Reyes and Gagara landed beside her a moment later with Tanegi, as always, bringing up the rear. The signs on many of the buildings had been removed, and were now labelled in Alistran Elvish. There was one exception, a small grocer's shop with the name Arliss Refuge Grocers written in bold letters on a plank above the door. The door and the windows were boarded up. The building hadn't been used since at least before the elves had invaded the place. Carlet's Refuge, Reyes commented absently. I've heard of the place, but never been here before. Their landing attracted only a little bit of attention from the elves that seemed to have made this village their own. It was as if Mangloss had been right. He had warned that the elves were now moving civilians into the country to colonise the land. There were soldiers in the village, but they looked more like a token militia than a force to be reckoned with. There were also several humans in the village. Most of them looked as if they hadn't had a change of clothes since the elves had first set foot in the village. For the most part, they sat out in the cold weather, hard at work at one task or another. The humans weren't wearing chains, but it was fairly obvious that they were nothing more than slaves. Enchanted, Reyes commented. He hated the idea of getting back into the air so soon, but neither did he want to stay here any longer than necessary. I'm not eating any food that's been prepared for me by an elf. I quite agree, Gagara replied. Let's move on. Not more than maybe 10 minutes after they left the village, Reyes could take the strain on his wings no more. He came in to land on the road, and as if to hide the fact that he was simply too tired to continue, he immediately started to gather some firewood. Handsome? Gagara asked worriedly as she landed beside him. It'll be the same thing at any village. The only humans we'll find will be slaves, and we can't trust the elves to feed us without trying to take advantage of us, Reyes told her. We'd do better to send Quinagoff and Tanegi hunting again, and cook our own food. Gagara nodded. She began to look around and help her husband in selecting the right firewood. Without an argument this time, Quinagoff and Tanegi went hunting as they had before. They had little more success than they had last time, but game was still very hard to come by. This time they brought back a deer, a scrawny-looking beast with very little in the way of meat on its bones. It was just after an hour later when Quinagoff said, "We should get back into the sky, my chief," as she chucked the last bone over her shoulder and climbed to her feet. Reyes felt a little uncertain about flying any further right now. Even after resting for an hour, his wings were still throbbing with the pain of tiredness. "I'm not sure I can go any further today." Quinagoff sounded a little uncertain. "We should take advantage of the weather before it starts to blizzard again." "My sister was right," Reyes said. "My wings need to rest. I almost lost them this morning." "We're well clear of the elves that saw us leave the encampment. We should stay here a while longer at least." Quinagoff nodded. "As you wish, my chief. If we're going to spend the night out here, we need to make that fire somewhat bigger. It might also be an idea for us to get off the road. I feel rather exposed here. Perhaps we should retreat into the woods for 100 yards or so." "Sounds good to me," Reyes agreed. "Ideally, I want you and Gagara to take refuge in the painting for the night, my chief," Quinagoff suggested. "It'll be a lot warmer in there and you can sleep on your own bed." "I can't," Reyes told her. "What if something happened to the painting while it was outside the ring? I daren't risk it. There was simply too much at stake." "As you wish, my chief," Quinagoff replied. "Let's just grab what we can of the remaining firewood and move into cover."